Hey, this is Darren at GitLab, and today I'm joined by Janice with Groupdesk, and we are going to talk about transitioning a hybrid team or a co-located team into a fully remote team. So we get this question pretty often, which is we can understand the concept of all remote, we understand the benefits of a team working 100% remotely, but if you're a company that established yourself earlier as a co-located company or a hybrid company, potentially before some of the tools, technology, processes, things like that were in place for a fully remote team to thrive, you may be looking at the landscape now and saying, well, this is where I want to get to, but what steps do I have to take? And is it even possible to convert or transition a partially remote company into a fully remote company? So Janice, thank you very much for joining me, and feel free to give the audience an overview of your situation and what you're thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Groupdesk, which is a B2B software company for travel companies. We help digitize and automate the unsexy parts of running a travel company, everything from lots of manual work of writing down passport numbers, payments, everything in between. And we are a 13-person company in total. We have always been co-located, but increasingly team members have moved away to become remote. Team members have started families, different obligations at home. And so working remote has started to become something that we just kind of allow people to do informally. And it's raised the idea of, okay, the tools have caught up with us. Selfishly, I'm on the road a lot, fundraising and doing sales. So I'm taking up, a desk space. Increasingly, we're based out of Toronto, Canada. Increasingly, rent is a consideration to think about. And it's kind of brought us to this idea of, are we better serving ourselves, our families, our customers, if we go fully remote instead of spending, upwards of an hour and a half for some of our folks commuting in each day. So that's kind of where we're at. Our staff are anywhere from first job as engineers. More of our people are closer to second and third kind of phases of their career. About half our team has families and young children, so they have that consideration, and some folks that care for family members at home. So other things are kind of starting to drive us to look at this as a potential solution for lots of different factors.
Well, I think you're on the right track just by acknowledging that. It kind of reminds me of Sid's story on how GitLab became all remote, which is he had this moment where he said, people are commuting an hour and a half in each day. Are we really getting an hour to an hour and a half worth of efficiency by having them in the office? And the conclusion was probably not. Yeah. We have the right tools in place. We can communicate with each other no matter where we're at, anywhere in the world. So software-wise, technology-wise, everything's in place. And then the missing piece was culture. How do we build a culture where people bond together as a team, they work well together as a team without seeing each other day to day? So for a company like yours that wants to kind of unwind and transition to fully remote, what I often recommend is for leaders to take a look and take a think at if everyone were to work from home tomorrow for a week or a month or a year, what would show up as sort of the cracks in the foundation? What gaps would need to be filled? What voids would make themselves apparent? And what this helps you do is kind of reverse engineer what you're leaning on in a co-located space. So that gives you an indication of what you'll need to replace or what you'll need to add to the company fabric to make sure that those gaps are filled when you go working all remote. The biggest thing is to have an all remote infrastructure. So ask questions like what voids would become apparent, what areas of communications would falter, what confusion would emerge, what tools that we use today that we would continue to use as a fully remote team, and what tools that empower fully remote teams should we consider if we're going in that direction. And what a lot of leaders overlook, but I think is very, very important, is the art of documentation. So for co-located teams, it is quite possible to never really document anything beyond what is legally mandated, because people are in the same space. And if you forget something, if you need to know how to do an expense report, for example, can probably ask someone in the general vicinity, and someone has done it recently enough, they've walked that path recently enough that they can give you the download and tell you how to do it. The problem with that is it's a very inefficient way of transferring knowledge. And you'll find that when you go all remote and you can't as easily tap someone on the shoulder to get an answer to something like that, it creates this friction where people just end up slacking each other all the time for just little tidbits of knowledge on relatively common work processes. So I think one of the ways that GitLab has really thrived as an all remote company is we believed in documentation, and the founding company was smart enough to lay a foundation of documentation very early on. So even for people joining the company now, 1,000 people in, you can look in the handbook, which is over 3,000 pages if printed, and you'll find answers to solutions that people have had over the years. And so this handbook was built iteration after iteration after iteration. It's not like we knew everything on day one, but you need to start somewhere. And I recently spoke with another founder, and she made a good point, which is she's making an effort to document everything, including things related to culture. So culture, a lot of people will just kind of let culture happen. Culture is just kind of the general vibe you get. But culture in a lot of ways is what is documented. Because if things aren't documented, some people have different experiences than others. Just kind of depends on your manager, depends on your team, depends on if you're an introvert or an extrovert, or how far you're willing to go, or how much you're willing to ask, that kind of thing. So even things like parental leave and vacation policies, all of these things end up tying back to culture. And if they're not well documented, where people can see them out in the open and make amendments or ask questions, that ambiguity can lead to friction and a breakdown of trust in an all remote team. And in our handbook, we actually list 5 of the key dysfunctions of remote teams, and absence of trust is one of them. So anything that you can do to build trust, and documentation goes a long way with that, will help on that front.
Do you find it, and I have read your handbook, which is great. Do you find though, and so I like that everything's codified, but do you find that it's like too prescriptive? It can lead people, I worry that it may lead people to think like, whoa, they've really like laid out the recipe here for how to be here.
Yeah, I think the way that we avoid that is in our values. You'll find sub-values. Give agency is a good example, where we in our values, we give people agency, we give people autonomy, and we empower people to do things the way they see fit. So if they see something that's documented, but they think they have a better way to do it, they aren't prohibited from putting forth a merge request to change that and make a suggestion to whoever owns that code or owns that process to make it better. And I think that's the big difference, where if you empower people to take a look at the processes and say, well, I have a better way to do that, let me have a civil way to put that forward, that helps break that down. Because you're right, if everything was documented to a T, but then only the executive team, for example, was ever able to change anything, then you box everybody in. And I know a lot of people can be scared about giving that much power to teams. Like, what's going to happen if we just let everybody comment on the parental leave policy? Honestly, it kind of goes back to hiring. If you hire really great people that believe in the vision, that believe in the culture, they're adults, they can be a manager of one, you tend to see less chaos when it comes to that. But it definitely, you need to instill that from the very beginning. And if you're transitioning a team, you need to make it clear that that's what you're transitioning to, and you want people to buy in. And if they don't buy in, that's a great time to try to facilitate a better place for them, a better fit for them. Because it's definitely not for everybody. I mean, all remote is absolutely amazing, and I would hope to never have it any other way, but it's certainly not for everyone. And some of the kind of ways of working are intimidating, and they can be difficult to acclimate to, especially if you've spent the bulk of your career in a co-located space.
Yeah, on that note, I think our hypothesis, I'll be careful about saying it's assumption or what we think, but our hypothesis is that if and when we announce this to our team and share the rationale, we think there's maybe 30 to 50% of people who will want to opt out. Like they want co-location, and candidly, some of those people we want to fight for. So do you do things like pay for people's co-working spaces if the co-location is like paramount to key people? How do you transition existing people who are really anti-remote for whatever reason? Like there's also folks on our team who their home situation is not conducive to quiet work or intense work or whatever that means.
That's such a great question and a great point. So I'll tell you how GitLab solves that. So we allow people to work from anywhere, but we don't mandate that they work from home. So there's a big nuance there. All we say is that there's no office to come into, but we're not saying you have to be comfortable working from home. We have a lot of people at GitLab that absolutely thrive with that social network. They thrive being a part of a bustling workplace. And so what we do is we'll actually reimburse co-working spaces. So if you want to have a monthly subscription to a co-working space, we'll reimburse it. And for us, that kind of ties back to creating an inclusive work environment and a diverse work environment where we don't mandate that anyone just works from their home. People can mix it up. If they want to work a few weeks at home and then a few weeks at a co-working space, totally fine. Yes, that is an expense to the company, but it pales in comparison to investing in huge offices and all the services that have to go along with those. And as you scale as a company, you got to think about moving offices and then the costs that come with that. If you're all remote and you land an amazing new client, you can ramp really quickly and hire a lot of new people to service that client without having to worry about how am I going to move offices. So yeah, we do that, and we do a few other things. We have an incentive called the visiting grant. So we actually partially reimburse travel whenever a GitLab team member travels to visit one or more other GitLab team members. And actually early on in the company, we had a couple of people really take advantage of this. And I think they traveled to 6 continents, visiting team members on 6 continents, and just kept the tab going. And yeah, that's another expense to the company, but honestly, it encourages the personal bonding. It proves that you care about informal communication. It proves that you still care about the value in in-person interactions, which become even more acutely important when you go all remote. So those in-person moments mean a lot more. You don't take them for granted as much as you would if you see someone day to day.
Yeah.
The other thing is we have a construct for in-person interactions. So every 9 to 12 months, we get the whole company together it's called an unconference, GitLab Contribute, where we do an opening keynote, an ending keynote, and then the whole week in between is excursions. It's just giving as much freedom as possible for people to just meet each other, get to know each other, put a face to a Slack name, that kind of thing. We have meetups throughout the year. We have conferences that we go to, sales events, sales conferences, where we try to get as many people as possible to come to those micro gatherings and those micro meetups. And actually, I recently spoke with someone, the founder of the Co-work experience, and part of what her business model is gathering smaller teams or subsets of larger teams and sort of taking them out to some foreign destination where it can be fun and they can get together and just bond as people, also do some work, but mostly just build bonds. And I think that her business model is thriving because remote teams are happening and they still realize that scheduled in-person interactions are really, really important. So I would hope that between all of that, you could kind of ease the fears of people that say, I'm going to miss the in-person interaction. And I think one other perk is if you're currently co-located where everyone comes to the same office, at least in the here and now, they're all relatively close. So they're located within the same region. And so you can encourage them to organize meetups. A great example is we have a holiday budget at GitLab. So we will encourage people that are relatively close together. So if people are in the Pacific Northwest or South Florida, they're relatively close. They can actually pick a day, travel together, have a great lunch together, contribute on a community project together, something like that. So one perk of going from a co-located space to an all-remote space is if you are all in the same place to begin with, I would say try to keep those bonds, like figure out monthly or quarterly meetups. It's not like you're saying goodbye to everybody forever. It just takes a little more effort to keep it going.
Yeah. And then the other big fear, I'll name it, is, and we were just talking about this today, my CTO and I, it's we trust our team, but because of the stage that they're at in their career, they've been always co-located, and the way you manage certainly engineering and technical people in a co-located space is very different. Feels like a low trust environment. And so he said today, I said, oh, why don't we try a week where we make it known and we try a week? And he goes, I just don't even know if we can trust them to get the work done in the same pace that we trust them in the office. And I said, well, then we have a different problem. Like, so how do you, if you believe that to be true, how do you, I don't know, how do you start to solve that, I suppose?
Yeah, I think openness and transparency is where it has to start. So if you're going to make this transition and you believe that people are too junior or they just appreciate hand-holding in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
I would say you just have an open and honest conversation with them, but position it as you're trying to further their career, like you're trying to help them. Because the truth of the matter is, if you're doing this, like they were hired into a co-located space, and now it's going to transition to something that's not that. So in some ways, the onus is on leadership to make that transition as easy as possible and not the other way around. And I will say, for more junior people, remote environments can be more difficult, not always. But a good example is GitLab is just now implementing a remote internship for engineers, because we needed a long runway of hiring relatively senior people that could be managers of one, that had enough work experience to understand how to operate independently, to get a big enough staff that we could actually carve out some of that staff to mentor interns that really haven't worked in any environment before, let alone a remote environment before.
Yeah.
And look, everyone is going to have different obstacles that they have to overcome. For some, it'll be the isolation factor. For some, it will be just a fear of reaching out, because they're just more comfortable tapping someone on the shoulder. So they may just sort of sit and let a problem kind of eat them alive instead of just reaching out and asking people. So managers need to be way more proactive, especially in the early stages of a transition, to make sure direct reports have everything they need. Like, are you okay? Do you have what you need? Is there a blocker? Like, is anything blocking you? What can I help facilitate? Kind of go over and above, especially during those early days, so that they're comfortable asking questions, because there will be a lot of questions. Like, you're dramatically changing how they work day to day. And if you make it feel like you're too busy with the transition to deal with their minutia or small mundane questions, they'll probably just shut down, and that's not a great path to go down.
Yeah. And then I guess in the transition, what would your opinion be or advice? Do you say, okay, by February 1st, we want to be fully remote? If you want to start that today and that's conducive to your life, you can start that today. Here's what that looks like. If you only want to start it on February 1st, you can do that. Or do you pull the Band-Aid off and say, we're all starting February 1st?
I think arguments can be made for both. Personally, I feel like giving the option to the individual is a more inclusive way to do it. As long as there is a set date where it's going to be transitioned fully over. And I think the other important element is, even for the people that might want to stay in the office, like let's say until the lease ends, I think as soon as you make the decision, you should start treating everyone as if they're remote. So for the people that choose to still be in the office, if they need to have a discussion about a certain client face-to-face, they need to sit down beside each other and type that conversation out in Slack. Even though it makes no sense, like they can look right at each other and verbalize it, but they have to be cognizant of the fact that some people are remote and they need to be all on the same playing field right away. Because the issue, if you don't do that, the people that made the early leap to remote will immediately feel like they're a second-class citizen, they're a little bit disconnected. And honestly, it'll make it even harder for the co-located people to ever go remote. Because they'll just keep hanging on to the habits that they've already had. So I don't really have an issue with people being in the same space as long as the work and communication gets done on whatever remote channels you deem appropriate. So everybody has to act like they're remote. If everybody's on a Zoom call, don't let the two people in the office kind of like hover around the same webcam. Everybody needs to open up their own computer, have their own webcam, their own microphone, to make sure it's one-to-one. And another thing I would say, for the people that jump early, I would really encourage them to document what that's like. Maybe once a week or every other week, maybe it's during the one-on-one where there's just this sort of download on what went well and what could stand to be improved, because I think that could actually turn into your eventual documentations on how to do remote meetings well at your company. So the people that jump early, just let them document, hey, this meeting went really well, and this is what we did to make sure it incorporated everyone well and there were no snags. Or in this meeting, this thing was briefly talked about, but I wish we would have had an agenda, and like this didn't get documented and this went wrong. That feedback becomes essential to what your eventual processes will be. And if you just sort of, if you don't institute a documentation process and it's just word of mouth, it's very hard to wrap your head around what should be done, like what to change, what to take away, because it's all just kind of hearsay, and it's, people have different experiences depending on if they're remote and if they're in the office. So just get people to write it down. And I'll say it feels inefficient. Documenting feels so slow. In the moment, you just want to use any other mechanism in the world, Slack, email, phone call, yelling, whatever. But the long-term efficiency gains of documentation are immense. And you really need to get buy-in on that culture for remote to work well. Because once there's no office, documentation is everything. It's the foundation for which everything else is built on.
Cool, thank you. And then my kind of last question is, as I look to part of what's exciting about remote is hiring talent anywhere, especially the languages that we code in. It's a bit of a rarer language. And so hiring talent that's had to move away because of the cost of living is exciting for us. How do you hire talent that has never before worked remote, but they are great on every other thing? How do you both communicate to them what that feels like? So it sounds like documentation a little bit and sharing the handbook, but then how do you determine their suitability for remote?
Yeah. One thing I'll say is there are some pretty amazing companies out there that facilitate remote hire. So Gigster is a great example. I don't know if you're familiar with Gigster, but they essentially go and find amazing people all over the world, and then they kind of have them at the ready for instances like this, where you want to go hire people, but you want them to already kind of be pre-vetted or maybe have some experience to work on. Gigster is a good one, and there are some others out there. But if you go and recruit someone, they're on paper, they're everything you want. The resume looks great, their prior work experience looks great, but they've never worked remotely before. So the qualities we look for in a great remote hire are largely the same as what we would look for in a great co-located hire. So people that are passionate, they're timely, they're dependable, they're driven. All of these things you would want if they're in the office or outside of the office. But even for people that have never worked remotely before, they have usually worked on a project at some point outside of the de facto office. So even if it's a person that's just graduated university, almost certainly they have an example of they were working with a class project in a group and they did some element of the project outside of the classroom, outside of the library. Maybe they went home for a holiday break and they needed to do their portion there. Chances are there's something they can think back on, like, oh yeah, I got that project over the finish line while I was at home. I went home early for holiday break, something like that. For most workers that have worked co-located, they've accomplished something on an airplane or in a hotel, or they've had to be home for a week to care for their kids and they've worked from there. I mean, in a way that is working remotely.
Yeah.
It's not like the de facto place that they worked, but almost everyone will have an instance like that. And so what we do is we try to ask people about those instances and just give them free rein to walk us through what that scenario looked like. So tell us about how you worked in the library, in the office, in the classroom, and then what did you do that was different or in addition to, or what have you, when you had to complete a portion of that project outside of that normal space. You can learn a lot by that situational analysis and letting people kind of explain how they would do things outside of the office. The other big perk about documentation is if your values and vision and strategy are all made public, you can share this with recruits before they even interview. And at the earliest stage of the interview process, you can have a candid conversation with them. Do these resonate with you? Is this why you want to work here? Are you aligned with this strategy? Do you have any objections to any of the values or mission or anything like that? It's actually kind of crazy that so many companies keep things like strategy and values behind closed doors, and then they only share that with someone like on their first week in the job.
Yeah.
And it's not doing either party a service, to be honest, because you're hiring someone and they have no idea if they're really aligned with your strategy or really aligned with their values, or if that's the best place for the person. So a lot of companies are kind of scared to put that out there, but it allows people to opt into your workplace and be self-selective, which is a more efficient way to recruit and hire. And we've been asked this recently where like, I don't have a documentation tool. I can't just have a million Google Docs. The discoverability issue is crazy.
Yeah.
And I'll say at GitLab, we build the handbook about.gitlab.com using GitLab. So anyone can use GitLab. It's a great tool for building and managing the handbook because of the discussions and the track changes. You can see how things evolve over years. It's really, really awesome. But I recently spoke with a company called Ask Almanac, A-S-K Almanac.
Mm-hmm.
And they're building a really awesome templatized tool for companies to have their own internal handbooks. And it's different than a wiki. We don't really think wikis scale that well, but Ask Almanac is built on templates from other companies that have done things really well. And then you can take it and modify it to your company. And they're just getting started, but I think the future for them is really bright, and hopefully they'll have some connectivity amongst other companies to sort of crowdsource best practices on things like all remote meetings as this becomes more popular.
Yeah, the other one I use is Fellow.
Yeah, okay.
Fellow.com. Yeah, they're good. More on how should I run a one-on-one, or how should I run a product meeting?
Right. Yeah.
I will say the documentation that you all did was eye-opening, because oftentimes I would read something and be like, oh, I didn't know I had to write that down. So all of that, it's like, oh, I should write that down.
Right. Yeah. Removing as many assumptions as possible is advised. And actually, I was just watching a call with Sid the other day, and he said, I assume you know. And he said, wait a minute. I shouldn't say that I assume you know. Like, we try to write everything down. And this is extremely important in an all remote setting, because context only comes from what is written down. There is no verbal cue. There's no body language. If it's just you staring into a spreadsheet or a screen, and you're not talking with another person, you're just trying to manage a project on your own, the only context you have is what someone wrote down. So we encourage people to add as much context as possible. Also, we work asynchronously, and if you start to scale up and you start hiring people in vastly different time zones, you're probably going to be forced into a situation where some of your team has to work asynchronously as well. And if you're moving projects along, the more you can write about them, the more you can document. It allows somebody to read that while you're asleep and fully get the picture, and not have to wait until you wake up to then virtually tap you on the shoulder and say, I read this, but I'm not quite sure how we got to this. Just assuming that no one knows anything about whatever you're writing down, and just try to add as much context as possible. Again, it feels inefficient, but it's one of those things that if you document a process in a way that saves someone from tapping you on the shoulder 20, 30, 40 times over the year, that's enough to dramatically change how productive you can be, or how much extra time you're able to cut out early and go spend time with family. And scaled across your company, it's the savings can be massive. So it's one of those things that never feels super good to have to document things in such a detailed and prescriptive way. But the downside of not doing that is you get bugged a lot more. You get asked the same question time and time again. There's ambiguity on the team. And what I've seen is that GitLabbers actually, we think really highly of each other because we go the extra mile to document things in a prescriptive way. It really shows respect for another person when you pay it forward by documenting something in such a way that when you pick something up that someone wrote and it's exactly what you needed, you're very grateful that that person took the extra time to do it. And then you're encouraged to document whatever the next solution that you find in a similar way. And it creates this positive, virtuous cycle. But it actually works the same in reverse. So if you start seeing sloppy documentation or you let sections of the handbook just go for years on end, you kind of think, well, maybe I'm not going to document this today, or I've got my answer, I'm good. Like whenever somebody asks me, then maybe I'll document it.
Hmm.
It takes buy-in, and it takes continual reminders. But if you get enough people on the same page, they start supporting each other, and that's what we've seen has worked really well.